Good evening and welcome to the Shakespeare Hour Live. My name is Simon Godwin. I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company. Welcome, everybody. Well, today I went to my local butcher in Marshall, Virginia, and I was surprised to see the face of the lady that worked there. And I realized that she was, of course, no longer wearing a mask. And I said, oh, do I have to wear my mask? And she said, if you are fully vaccinated, you do not. So I took it off for the first time in a year and really experienced a feeling of change and progress, and dare I even say renewal. Of course, the pandemic is by no means over, yet this did feel like a milestone of change. We are at episode 44 of the Shakespeare Hour Live, incredible. And it also therefore feels an appropriate moment for us to be celebrating our 44th and a show with the recognition that this is also our final show, at least for the time being. Change comes and we've tracked this journey together. And I'm really excited therefore to be speaking this evening about endings, Shakespeare's last act. Before we get started, I'd like to thank a few sponsors. Shakespeare Hour Live is part of a wider project called Shakespeare Everywhere, which is in turn supported by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. Additional support is generously provided by Nan Beckley, and tonight's episode is sponsored by Amy Weinberg and Norbert Horstein. Corporate support for this episode is provided by Empowered Strategists. So my thanks to everyone that has made tonight possible. Well, of course, we are nothing without our extraordinary guests, and we have a particularly remarkable group joining us this evening for our final episode. Let me begin by welcoming Dr. Daniel Pollock Pelzner, acclaimed Shakespeare scholar and scholar in residence at the Portland Shakespeare Project. He is a regular contributor to the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and many more. Daniel, good evening. Are you with us?
Hi, Simon. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, welcome, Daniel. It's a real joy to have you on the show. I know we've been corresponding a lot through the year about Shakespeare matters, and it's wonderful to have you here. Daniel, let me begin by putting you on the spot. We're talking about endings and change tonight. Are you a fan of beginnings, or are you an endings man, or are you a man who enjoys the in-between?
I think in real life, I far prefer beginnings. I have young children, so beginnings are times of excitement and endings mean either tears or a hunger or sleep. So I love beginnings, but in art, there is nothing more thrilling than I feel at the end of a Shakespeare play when everybody who's been missing connections with each other suddenly appears on the same stage together, and we have a sense of community forming. And I feel like as we hope the pandemic is ending, we can have that community forming in real life too.
That's beautiful, Daniel. Thank you. And I think you're already describing something that we're going to be dwelling on this evening, which is what is that atmosphere that is generated at the end of a great Shakespeare production? How could we describe it? I'm thinking of D.H. Lawrence's line about sensitive expectancy. And it's something of that came to mind when you talked about that feeling of something cohering in a group. So that's wonderful. A fan of beginnings in life and endings in art. Let me move on to Myra Lucretia Taylor, Tony Award-winning nominated actress. Her many incredible credits include Broadway's Tina, the Tina Turner musical, STC's Macbeth, The Tempest at the Public Theatre, and The Winter Tale and Pericles at, of course it's not, but just that it's British, the Royal Shakespeare Company. So Myra, hi, good evening. How are you?
Oh, good evening. I'm well. How are you?
Well, I'm extremely well, Myra. Thank you. And did you have good memories of performing with the Royal Shakespeare Company? Was that a happy time for you?
Oh, it was wonderful. Because maybe not for the reason you think, it's because nobody knew my story. So I was able to go, I was almost undercover.
Yeah.
Nobody really knew me. So I was kind of able to almost reinvent myself.
Yes. Well, I have some inkling of that coming from Britain and arriving in America, where no one knew, quite who I was when I arrived. And there's something liberating, isn't there, about being in a new context?
Oh, it was very liberating. And the people I met there, I'm still friends with some of them. I became very acquainted with port.
Ooh, lovely.
Love leaving the theater and then going over to the Duck. And, oh, it was just fun. It was just a good time. And back then the RST, the large theater, was kind of, there's no feeling like it to be in a space that large and having to communicate to that many people with that language. It's like, there's nothing like it.
It's a remarkable platform, isn't it? And let me ask you, Myra, beginnings, middle, and endings, how do you feel about, where do you sit in that kind of spectrum?
I don't know. I guess in art, I prefer beginnings because I know we'll get to the end.
Yep.
And in life, well, it's almost now like I'm dealing with a bit of that. I'm a caregiver, and we don't know what's going to happen. But you know, a lot of things are brought up for me, especially at this time. So I don't know if I prefer it, but I feel like I'm living it.
Yeah, thank you, Myra. That's wonderful, and thank you so much for bringing your grace to the show. Thank you. Tony Award-winning director Mary Zimmerman is with us too. Her STC credits include Pericles, Candide, and Argonautica. In addition to her amazing directing career, she is the Jaharis Family Chair of Performance Studies at Northwestern University. Mary, so many of our audience at STC have spoken to me about your incredible work, how much your shows have mattered to our audience. So it really is a joy to welcome you on the show this evening. How are you, Mary?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I love working in DC. I really like it.
Great. Well, that's good. So hopefully you'll come back. And
I have a very, very, very best friend, Natsu Onoda Power, who's a theater artist in DC. She and I go back many a decade, and I get to spend time with her. But I love DC.
Oh, well, DC loves you, Mary. So thank you. Yes, let me just finish this section by asking you, Mary, about beginnings, middle, and endings, transitions, or conclusions, or indeed prologues. How are you feeling about where you sit with all of those things?
I'm just going to answer as a director. I'm, especially in things that I'm writing, but even if I haven't, I want to clear that price of admission really early on. And so I want a beautiful or gripping beginning. Sometimes I think the set design itself clears the price of admission, and that's really good. And then I love doing transitions, and I don't know that I've done maybe 2 blackouts in my career, because I love an a vista transition. I always think you should squeeze every moment of, beauty and time you can get out of that stage. But I will say that I'm always driving towards the end and trying to figure out like how to get a kind of an A+ on that end to, I'm always trying to go for the transcendence and the reunion. Yeah. Even if that's a reunion through death at the end. So I think I'm always pointed towards those ends.
And I think, Mary, you've described, well, one thing I think of the phrase, you never get a second chance to make a good first impression.
That's true. But, it's also true that an evening at the theater that's been a little bit mediocre can kind of pull it out in that last 10 minutes, and people leave the theater like, that was great. And honestly, I have seen productions that were like, I'm a teacher, so C+ all night, and then like A++ in those final moments. And that's what you leave with, you know?
So true, so true. Terrific. Well, but I also want to identify the reference you made to the notion of reunion sometimes through death, which is a very Shakespearean paradox that I think we'll also be unpacking this evening. How is it that we gain something by losing something? To be continued in a moment. We have, of course, the Shakespeare Theatre Company Shakespeare Our Live team with us tonight. Grace Ann, who's been doing such incredible work for the last 44 episodes and bringing the show together every week, bringing the guests together every week, and of course, speaking with you, our very precious and valuable audience. Grace Ann, how are you tonight?
I'm great. I can't believe it's episode 44, and we're taking a break for a little while. I can't believe this is it, but we have such a great group. I know it'll be a fabulous way to go. So.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Grace Ann. And last but not least, of course, my colleague and co-host, Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg. Drew, let me hand over to you to get the discussion started this evening. Hello and welcome, Drew.
Thank you, Simon. And I just want to quickly vouch for middles. Nobody's talking about middles here, but the great German theoretician Bertolt Brecht, he said you could have your eyes on the finish line or your eyes on the course. in plays? What about the middle? What about what happens in the middle of plays? I'm getting very animated all of a sudden. So the topic we're discussing tonight is Shakespeare's late plays, which is a loose category including Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. We've actually touched on this a lot over the previous 44 episodes. Way back in episode 4, which was the beginning of the pandemic, we talked about The Winter's Tale and The Tempest with Peter Marks, Rebecca Teichman, and Patrick Page. We've talked about Julie Taymor's film of The Tempest with Julie herself, her star, Dame Helen Mirren, and Dr. Peter Holland. We've had an episode on The Winter's Tale. We've never discussed, however, Pericles and Cymbeline, the plays that precede these two final masterworks by Shakespeare. So hopefully we can work towards a kind of definition of what it is about these 4 plays that is so unique, arguably, in the Shakespearean canon. And I wonder, Daniel, if we could start with you. How do you explain this sudden shift that happens right at the very end of Shakespeare? He's written 30 some odd plays, and then all of a sudden he starts writing maybe in a different type of dramatic register. So what sets these plays apart, and maybe what links them back to earlier works in Shakespeare's career?
It is really tempting to have a kind of psychobiographical view of Shakespeare's career and see him coming out of this period in the early 1600s of writing these intensely rich and passionate tragedies, and then moving toward this sort of beautiful autumnal phase where he starts to experiment dramatically and think, what if you had an Othello who distrusted his wife and she died, but then she could come back to life, and you've got The Winter's Tale? Or what if you had a Hamlet who was avenging a usurpation plot and got all of his enemies together and then decided to forgive them, and you've got The Tempest? Or what if you had a king who banished the young daughter who truly loved him, and she came back in time for him to recognize her and for them to be reunited, and you've got Cymbeline, or a sort of combination of all of these plots, a king who's lost his daughter and his wife, and they both come back, and you've got Pericles. And since the sort of late 19th century, with a scholar named Edward Dowden, there's been a kind of category that Dowden coined that he suggested that these 4 plays fit together under the label of romantic plots. And he was thinking in part of romantic poetry, which he wrote a lot about, but also this medieval genre of the romance, which is a kind of adventure story where knights set out to encounter supernatural forces and then get reunited with long lost parents and siblings, and maybe even back to ancient classical Greek and Roman romances, of which the Odyssey might be a kind of forerunner, stories of episodic adventures, often over great spans of space and time, that involve love and obstacles and divine intervention. And this guy Dowden in the 1870s thought that this was Shakespeare's mellow phase at which he had reached what Dowden called an exquisite recreation. So he could return to, shipwreck plots from Twelfth Night and sea plots from Comedy of Errors, and father-daughter plots from Lear and Much Ado, and mistaken identity plots from Twelfth Night and As You Like It, and kind of weave them all together into this graceful movement toward reconciliation away from violent tragedy. That's an appealing way to see Shakespeare as kind of a wise old man anticipating his return to his own wife and daughter, perhaps, in Stratford. But there's a lot that you have to ignore in order to tell this story about Shakespeare. And so one thing that you have to ignore is that Shakespeare actually wrote a number of other plays at the end of his career that don't fit into these categories. He wrote another history play called All Is True, or Henry VIII, which is sort of, depending on how you view it, either basically Tudor propaganda celebrating the birth of Queen Elizabeth as a kind of divine intervention into British history, or a Catholic nostalgia plot reminiscing about the wonderful order that Henry VIII's Reformation overthrew. And he wrote a bromance called Two Noble Kinsmen, taking a story out of Chaucer and collaborating with John Fletcher, the playwright who became Shakespeare's successor with the King's Men. That is a kind of throwback to Two Gentlemen of Verona, really interested in the love between men and what happens when a woman comes in between that. So Dowden sort of doesn't talk about all those plays, and he actually has to ignore a lot of Cymbeline and a lot of Pericles too. He really just likes the Tempest, and he wants to see Shakespeare as a kind of benign Prospero. And this also has to do with Dowden himself. He was a fierce opponent of Irish independence, and so he liked plays that affirmed a kind of conservative monarchical order at the end. And he also seemed to have liked women who suffered silently for their chastity. So he loved Marina from Pericles, the daughter who's able to resist temptation in a brothel and be reunited with her father. He loved Hermione in The Winter's Tale, the wronged wife mistakenly suspected of infidelity, who is resurrected in the end of the play. He didn't know what to do with Paulina, this amazing voice of reason and justice who chastises the king in The Winter's Tale. And he had trouble with gendered elements that didn't fit his view and political elements that didn't fit his view. So I think we could tell this kind of biographical story about Shakespeare, or we could tell a historical story and see these plays less as late Shakespeare and more as middle Jacobean, that is, plays that were written near the middle of the reign of King James. And what we know about the kind of box office of the 1610s or so is that the vogue was for a new style of play that John Fletcher, Shakespeare's sort of up-and-coming successor, popularized, called Tragicomedy, which were plays that started as tragedies and then ended as comedies. And so that Shakespeare would choose to write in this genre could be because of his own temperament, just like perhaps, Kenneth Branagh might have shifted from directing Henry V and Hamlet to directing Thor and like Murder on the Orient Express and Jack Reacher because he felt that there was something he could only express in those genres. Or it could be that that was what drew audiences and that's what the like cool young writers were doing. And it's also a time when Shakespeare became Shakespeare's company was under the patronage of the King's Men. And the king at the time, King James I, was fascinated by love and intimacy between men. He was obsessed and horrified by supernatural events. He was deeply interested in expanding England's borders, both within the British Isles and overseas. And so perhaps it's not entirely surprising that Shakespeare is writing plays that are paranoid about female sexuality, that have lots of elements of dubious divine intervention, and that are really mapping out the known world at the time. So Pericles is journeying all around the Mediterranean. The Tempest is somewhere between Bermuda and Tunisia and Italy. Cymbeline is sort of moving from the borders of the Roman Empire to the borders of the British Empire. Winter's Tale, inventing lands that don't have geographies that we can recognize on the map. And so I think there are many ways in which we could see these as sort of lovely autumnal works, or we could see them as Jacobean works that are really renegotiating what gender and power and nationality mean at a fraught time for England.
Wow. Well, thank you, Daniel, for that bracing reminder that there is a Victorian mythology that accompanies much of accepted Shakespeare wisdom, and that when you start unpacking these plays from a Marxist or a feminist or a colonial perspective, or just a historiographical one, you see it in a whole new way. Myra, I'm curious, as a theater practitioner, what you've played many of the roles in these late plays, if they are to be considered late. What do you gravitate to in these plays, and what do you think the unique challenges are in bringing them to life as opposed to maybe, say, other works by Shakespeare?
Wow, I almost feel like that's like I should give a Paul Lind answer, because they asked me. But it's the emotions. In these plays, it's the sense of loss, getting to grapple with that. And then how do we make our way through that and make our way back as human beings? That's kind of my job. That's why I'm here. That's what I'm doing, to help people deal with these emotions. And these plays have them, I mean, what Paulina has to go through, what Prospero has to go through, it is so wonderful and it is so painful and it is so human and it is so big. It's not small time at all. The process, I would say, I found that Tempest was super hard. And Oscar Eustace had to tell me why. He came to a few of our rehearsals, but one of the first ones he came to is because he said, well, Prospero is kind of like the whole show. Prospero generates all of this stuff. It's like this, and then you go on and there's a parenthetical and on and on and on. And you know, other plays, it might be like, I'm going to pick some flowers. And the other character says, well, what kind? Prospero, it's, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, do that, and then you'll do that, and you'll do that. And it was so hard to kind of carry all of that, have all of that responsibility. But ultimately, it was so rewarding, especially the Tempest, because we did it as mobile Shakespeare. And that was before we came to the public for a sit down. So mobile Shakespeare, the audience is on 4 sides of you. They're usually 2 feet within you, but close to you. And it's kind of like you really haven't lived until you're in front of a 6-year-old who is entirely wrapped and eating a bag of potato chips, an entire bag of potato chips, while you're doing what you're doing. That's life. That is the stuff of life. So that is what draws me to these plays and to Shakespeare, just in general.
And it's interesting you identified these kinds of extremes of emotion, extremes of happiness and sadness, extremes of spectacle or magic in some ways, but also this incredible intimacy that Shakespeare seems to be exploring when you're in front of the proverbial six-year-old with a bag of potato chips.
But totally in it. But, and then what is magic? You know, you can have big arguments with people about what is the magic. I was thinking about that today. Is it the nexus of kind of intention and imagination and will and then that's magic? I don't know. But magic does happen, doesn't it? Not only in these plays, but in our lives. It does.
And speaking of magic, Mary, your Pericles, I was not lucky enough to work on it, but I know people who did work on it at Shakespeare Theater, and audiences still talk about what a magical experience that was in the theater. It's also interesting that you chose Pericles, which is one of the maybe lesser known works, I think it's fair to say, in the canon. Was there something about Pericles?
I mean, I was asked by Simon's predecessor to do it, but it's right up my alley in a million ways. It's difficult and problematic and has lots of, you know, lots of strange epic sorts of things to stage. It's actually narrative, and you know, I've adapted a lot of narrative literature for the stage. Has a million transitions. It goes all over the world. So it was up my alley in a bunch of ways.
And do you think that there is something different about these late plays from the rest of Shakespeare's work?
Well, when you look at the romances, I'm tempted to say yes, that Adam Gopnik wrote a beautiful article in the New Yorker many, many years ago about the late work of painters, I think it was, and composers, and how often those works end up being decried, that they're not critic pleasing very much, but they come out of a person who has nothing left to prove and is really just doing what they feel like. And I think it's enchanting that Shakespeare, as you were saying, Daniel, might have reverted back to just such sort of swashbuckling tale. You know what I mean? Just so plotted, so much plot and adventure and magic and the appearance of the divine and redemption and recovery, all of that. So yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know if they're qualitatively different really, but they're the ones I'm attracted to. I'm attracted to all the romances and to the problem plays. And by the way, I just want to say, I have directed Henry VIII. I just want you to know, I'm a rare person in this world at New York Shakespeare Festival in the Park, Shakespeare in the Park. And when Joseph Papp wanted to do all of them in a row, and they shoved Henry VIII to the very end, and then they got me to do it.
Wow, so I'm sure tales to tell about that production, which maybe for another time. But Daniel, you had a point you wanted to make.
Well, I love that Mary's pointing out the theatrical appeal of Pericles. And even though it's a play that, you probably, if you poll your live audience, how many, unless they had the good fortune to see Mary's production, or Joe Hodge did a wonderful one recently at OSF, not on too many people's top 10 Shakespeare list. But actually, if we look at publication records in the 17th century, it was the most printed Shakespeare play. It went through more editions than any other play. And it begins with this prologue of a medieval poet, John Gower, a contemporary of Chaucer, coming on stage and saying, to sing a song that old was sung. Is that the line? To sing a tale that old was sung, I come. And so it's like a greatest hit. And romance as a genre was not that common on stage until the later era, but it was very popular as a prose fiction reading narrative, the way like you can buy romances at the the supermarket checkout aisle now. And it was a very popular genre in the 1590s, so when Shakespeare was starting his career. So there was kind of a fun throwback quality in 1608 or 1609 to telling this old familiar tale that everybody knew from Greek telling that Gower had retold, and then had been retold many other times. And that, it's like getting a girl group together. It's like the dream of the 90s is alive again now. And so even though it's not in our top list, Shakespeare's audiences seem to love it, and it plays really well because it's so full of these great episodic adventures.
Right, and I believe, isn't it true that The Winter's Tale is based on a Robert Greene source from the 1590s? One of the
yeah, Pendosto. Right.
Yeah, you had a point, and I
was just going to say that I remember researching that and finding that out, that it was one of his most popular plays, which gave me great cheer, because I remember someone came to interview me, and then the little pre-show article was all about why are they doing this terrible play. And then we actually were super good, and he had to eat a plate of crow, I think. But Gower's a bit of a problem, and there's a kind of repetitiveness to his entering and coming on and being narrative. I solved it by starting I skipped Gower's opening line, started in the middle of the scene where the riddle's happening. And then at a kind of pause, these two ladies in waiting turned out and in tandem said the opening. So there was a kind of a cold opening, I guess. And then we kind of dissolved Gower into all different members of the company who kind of tossed around one of those little 4-inch big old volumes of Shakespeare. And then we could read some of those fun stage directions like Exit Pursued by Pirates or The Pirates Enter, and make some hay out of that as well. I think sometimes people try to deal with Gower by having him or her sing, but singing goes way much slower than speaking even. And I think it can end up, deciding to add time is maybe not for me the best solution. Although I always throw music in, you have to have music in Shakespeare plays, I sort of feel like.
Simon, you're dying to make a point.
Well, I just want to capture one thing before. Well, there's two things I want to hold on to Myra's provocation about what is magic. I think that's such a beautiful question about what is magic on the stage, what is magic in life. And I'd love to hear, Grace Ann, I'll come back in a second, see whether anyone has written in on the chat about what they think. The second thing I want to just speak about fashion for a moment, because on this program, we've charted a little bit about the strange parallels between Shakespeare's time and our own as we've traveled through this year. And we know that Shakespeare's own theatres were closed due to the plague. And I think that's been a point of focus. And we know that he came back after the plague with some of the plays that he'd been writing during the plague. And in this case, his late plays included, let's say, Daniel, after your great advice to us all about not trying to be encyclopedic or comprehensive, we can only ever be partial, but included plays of reunion and magic. And it makes me think my recent trip to, of all places, Los Angeles, which I'm a bit overexcited about because I've never been before. But what all these people were saying to me from the world of television and film was, the musical is back. Everybody wants to see a musical on the screen. And I was just reflecting on that when we were talking about the return of the romance to the stage, stuff that Shakespeare was around when Shakespeare started, but suddenly became in fashion again. Maybe we're in a place of healing or kind of wanting to come together, wanting to tell a slightly different kind of story, a different kind of atmosphere now, in the same way that Shakespeare was feeling when he came back to write these fable type stories. Anyway, provocation. Before we hear our responses to that, let's ask Grace Ann how our audience are feeling tonight.
And they're feeling really good. And actually, they are all picking up on the stage direction conversation that Mary started. Viewer Craig, he asks the panel, I'd love to hear your thoughts. which is the goofier stage direction, exit pursued by a bear or enter pirates? So if you had to pick your favorite, which would you pick? And viewer Neil, he cites, Mary, that moment specifically where in your Pericles, the direction was read aloud on stage and that it was just a riot, he says. So, you know, we're all tracking tonight.
It's actually quite Brechtian, isn't it, Mary? The idea of having literarizing Shakespeare or making him literary form once more.
Yeah. Well, because the play suggests that, you know, that this is a tale that's told or printed or just known, as Daniel was saying. I guess in a way you have to go with Pursued by a Bear because it's just such a classic. People who don't know much of anything about Shakespeare know that direction. But can I pick up on something that Simon was saying though? Guys, don't you agree that if this whole last experience of this last year has taught us anything, it's that presence matters and makes a difference, and that the theater on the screen is not the thing, and that there is something happening collectively between the performers and the audience, a kind of agreement to make real, you know, the invisible, to coalesce our feelings together. That happens in the theater. That I think that is what we're missing, and it just is different. You know, it's just not the same.
Totally, Mary. And before I hand over to Myra and Daniel and to Mary and Dee for some text of Shakespeare, I just want to leap on that segue back to the real, the importance of presence. Thank you, Mary, because just to let the folks know watching tonight that immediately after the Shakespeare Live this evening, we're going to be announcing our new season of shows. So do around 8:35 on Vimeo. I always want to say Vimeo, but I don't think that's the correct way of saying it. We shall be sharing the next 12 months of actual shows at Shakespeare Theatre Company. Anyway, Drew, back to you to pilot us through some text from our wonderful guests tonight, Drew.
Yeah, so speaking of absence, speaking of presence, obviously we're still mediated by screens, by Zoom, by Vimeo. I love Norman's very Brit pronunciation. But yeah, I wonder if maybe this is a theory I'm trying out now, with Shakespeare's latching onto this fad of having tragicomedies and magic in order to more intensify the liveness of the theater. There's all this hocus pocus, and then there's a person in front of you being real. So I wonder, Myra, we asked you to select a passage, maybe from when you played Prospero. And I'm curious to hear why you chose the passage that you did. And if you could maybe set the scene for us. You're making a face like.
Oh, no. I was thinking about what Mary said about, you know, being in front of live audiences, and I'm definitely going to get to what you were saying. But what I'm looking forward to is the trust that is a part of the contract of being in the same room. All of us being in the same room together is trust. And I'm looking forward to getting back to that. But what I chose is after the big pageant has happened in the Tempest. And then all of a sudden, Prospero remembers, oh my goodness, these people are plotting against me, and looks over at the kids and says, "You do look, my son, in a movement sort as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, are all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air." I mean, it goes on, but I used to love being at that point because it seemed like the jangliness of it was just so sweet. It was that we're witnessing this wonderful pageant, but yet then there's this other reality of what you're upset, but how can you be upset? This is all going to go away. It's what we deal with every day in life, knowing that things are impermanent, but trying our hardest to make each moment matter. That'll make you crazy. And actually at the end of the speech, Prospero does say, "My old brain is troubled. Be not disturbed." It's just like, let me get this together. There's a lot going on. I turn to, I'll walk to still my beating mind. I just love the humanness of it, the contradictions of it that we have to try to resolve.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. And I also think another layer, it's one of the great anti-theatrical moments in Shakespeare. I forget what critic wrote this, but it's like you're in the middle of a dress rehearsal, everything's going great, and then the director yells, "Stop, stop, stop." and just starts going on about how fake everything is and how, oh, sorry, I'm just having a bad day. I need to go cool off a little bit, right? It has that effect of stopping everything dead in its tracks and just being real about
being real, but everything stops in its tracks, being real, and then let's get on with it.
Yes. But also, I can't help thinking, and I don't know whether there's a term for it, but it's a clever thing when somebody says, I'm thinking of Mercutio when he's stabbed, he says, you know, it is but a scratch. And yet by diminishing the wound, it makes it more worrying and upsetting for all of us. And I think there's a further magic trick in that text, that the more somebody says, oh, it's just nothing, it's just an illusion, the more perversely we're brought into the illusion, or the sense of magic, or the sense of something being nurtured that is highly unusual. So by smashing the artifice is also somehow deepened.
Interesting, Myra.
I love it.
Have a thought.
I was just going to say that I suggested this passage to my little theater company, The Looking Glass. An actor went into our empty theater and did our revel. This was during the pandemic as sort of a fundraiser. Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, we're all spirits and are all melted into air. And it's sort of rehearsing, you know, all of our revels of being in the theater, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, reminiscent of Shakespeare's globe, shall dissolve. We are such, and leave not a rack behind. I mean, it was so melancholy and so true that we were bereft and left of our, of our revels. That felt illusory. Don't you feel like your past life is like, did I used to be in the theater? Did I actually rehearse people and do plays? And a kind of crisis of confidence about it too. Like, do I still know how to do that? I've been practicing it since I was a child. And to be, we of all people just could not practice our vocation, during this time. It's just been remarkable.
Right, this sense of, was that real? All of this putting on fake stuff.
Mm-hmm. But we believe it so deeply, but poof, it's gone.
But I'm looking forward to the interface. I'm looking forward to picking up that contract. I mean, we've got to come together.
Yeah,
and what you do when you stand on the stage as an actor and you look at an audience and they look back at you, what I just said, there is a trust there. There is a contract. Absolutely. And it's a wonderful thing. And I hope we get back there.
We will, Myra. Daniel's going to come in, I think, with some text. Before he does so, Grace Ann, do you anything want to share from the audience before we hear from Daniel?
Not at the moment. I think we're all just enjoying your reading, Myra. I know a lot of people are resonating with what you said before we got to the text about your definition as magic, as the definition of it as intention and imagination and will. There's been some conversation about that. And so I'm sure the text is still just soaking in.
Terrific. What a great line. Daniel, yes, share with us your Shakespeare.
I was thinking of a line from The Winter's Tale, and this comes at the end of the play after the king has tried his wife for treason, for rebelling against his authority by, he says, sleeping with his best friend, and she has apparently died. And then 16 years have passed, and she now appears as a statue that's unveiled by her friend and the sort of voice of conscience in the court, Paulina, who presents this statue of the king's seemingly dead wife, Hermione, to the king, Leontes. And he is amazed at how lifelike it looks and wants to touch it. She tells him to resist, but says that she's going to bring it to life through some sort of magic. And this is a moment when we might think about Myra's wonderful question of what magic is in the theater. And we might think, historically a little bit. So this is a time when Shakespeare's company not only has that outdoor Great Globe itself performance space, but has also taken over the indoor Blackfriars Theater, in part because the plague in the 17th century hit young people much worse than it hit old people, unlike our COVID, and wiped out the boy acting companies who used to perform in that indoor space, who were also falling afoul of King James because they did slightly edgier satiric work. So the performance venue was open because the company was wiped out. Shakespeare's company saw an opportunity, and they moved in the wintertime to this indoor space where they had artificial lighting. They had candles, and so they could do lots of special effects. And they had a more intimate space, not quite as intimate as Myra with this wonderful 6-year-old eating chips, but pretty close, because there would be actually an audience sitting on stage. So maybe actually like this boy. And so you could do music effects as well that had a much more dynamic range than you could in the Globe. And so there's a thinking that perhaps some of the wonderful spectacle that Mary could conjure in her Pericles was afforded for Shakespeare's company because of the technology of an indoor playhouse and what that allowed. And that might have to do with this statue that Paulina is going to bring to life. And I was hoping that, since Myra, you played Paulina in the States and at the RSC, you might be willing to read this line that we have for us, in which Paulina explains how this statue is going to come to life.
Of course. It is required you do awake your faith. Then all stand still. Or those that think it is unlawful business I am about, let them depart.
Isn't that I mean, I want to be back in the theater too, but just hearing you, Myra, over the Zoom, I'm still getting the thrill of this speech. And one thing that fascinates me about it is what kind of faith is required to awaken a statue. And so we might think of that in terms of religious faith, say, and there's certainly a kind of maybe residual Catholic narrative. The Protestant Reformation outlawed the worship of saints, including Mary, who was a source of solace for particularly many women in the Catholic era. And so perhaps these stories of mothers recovered, like Hermione or like Thaisa in Pericles, could be kind of filling the place that the cult of Mary, the Marian cult, had filled in a Catholic worship space. So there could be a kind of religious faith. But of course, there's also the suspension of disbelief, the faith in the power of art itself. Rich McCoy has a wonderful book called Faith in Shakespeare, in which he talks about the kind of trust that you were describing, Myra, the willingness that we have to invest an illusion with a lifelikeness or reality, so that we could believe that there were solemn temples and cloud-capped palaces on stage before Prospero made them disappear. And this was a feature of the Jacobean court as well. King James loved to have very expensive multimedia spectacles called masks that mostly would glorify his own power, as Prospero seems to be glorifying his for his children, but that would just showcase all the latest technology of stage presentation. And so there's a certain quality in which that's being presented too. But then the last thing I would suggest maybe seems to me slightly less savory, which is that this is the word faith recurs a lot in The Winter's Tale, and it usually comes up when people don't believe women in the play. That is, the king accuses Hermione of breaking her faith with him by alleging her infidelity, and then says that he doesn't have faith, he doesn't credit her speech. And so Paulina is in a way giving a reminder that he has to believe Hermione in order for her to come back to life. And I think this is a really beautiful moment, but it's also a reminder that Leontes the king, just before this, has been really interested in an attractive young woman who's just appeared in his court, who he doesn't know is his daughter, his long lost offspring by Hermione, the girl Perdita, who was raised for 16 years away in Bohemia and has now returned. And that threat of incest hovers over a lot of Shakespeare's plays. And indeed, in Pericles too, Pericles is reunited with his daughter in a brothel where she's being offered to sleep with him. So I love the beauty and power of late period Shakespeare, but there's also something, I think you could see it as kind of late period Woody Allen. That is a sketchy guy at the end of his career recycling his earlier greatest hits with a very disturbing fixation on the sexuality of young women. And I think I think that gendered element is part of the investment of artistic or religious faith that we're wrestling with in this scene.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for these provocations as well as these wonderfully lucid readings of the ends of these plays. It is an interesting link between Pericles and The Winter's Tale, not just in the kind of shall we say inappropriate or incestuous overtones between father and daughter, but also the way that Shakespeare seems to discover a new kind of recognition scene in Pericles, and then maybe refine it in The Winter's Tale with this moment. It is required you do awake your faith. I wonder, Mary, yeah, Simon, and then Mary.
Just briefly before we bring Mary and Daniel, yes, it's an interesting provocation, a striking one about Leontes' shock at meeting Pelzner. He doesn't know who she is when he encounters her first, only later realizes that she is his daughter. One could, I guess, argue, of course, multiple ways, but when I've worked on it, I was reminded, just to speak of my own life for a moment, though, about how recognition works within us. And I remember my first time I was in love with somebody for a long time, and the relationship ended, and I actually met the lady's sister working as a usher at the Royal Court Theatre. And I was just bumped into when I was taking my seat, and it was the sister, and I had this overwhelming reaction of remembering the love in the sister. And I suppose what was striking for Leontes is that, yes, the incest quality is perhaps there, but so too is this moment when he's just met somebody that is his own and is deeply reminiscent of the woman that he's loved, and perhaps even reminiscent of himself. He doesn't know who she is, but so his absorption, his surprise, his shock is also Shakespeare giving credence or space to a man grappling with the image of himself through the female.
That's a beautiful way of reading it, and you could certainly sustain it on stage, particularly with many productions that double the roles of Hermione and Perdita, and so there would be that same recognition. Now, Drew had mentioned Shakespeare's prose source, Robert Greene's Pandosto, and in that prose source, Leontes does indeed fall in love with his daughter and pursues a sexual relationship with her, then recognizes, like Oedipus, what he's done and kills himself. And Shakespeare veers away from his source material here in a lovely way that I think accommodates the reading that you're suggesting, Simon, but in a way that might remind audiences who read the novel back in the 1590s that there's a kind of shadow of that danger that has to be escaped here.
Yeah, fascinating. And we learn so much, don't we, by somebody, the way they relate to their sources, which you beautifully illumine, Daniel. Mary.
I was just going to say that, Pericles begins with him fleeing in horror from a riddle to which the unspeakable answer is that the king is sleeping with his daughter, sort of consensually, actually. And I don't see that between Marina and Pericles at all. He doesn't meet her in the brothel. He's on shipboard and depressed. He won't move, and they call a chaste maid to him, who's singing can hopefully revive him. He won't even look at her for the longest time. And I guess I don't want to go there so much, that I do feel that recognition, that attraction is more the type in the other plays, what Simon is speaking of, that it's the reflection of the beloved mother that's lost, that's drawing out the heart of the guy. It's the lost mother,
Well, clearly what's interesting in both plays is that there is a lost mother figure, and then a father reunited with a daughter with whom he is entirely unfamiliar, who basically seems to be presented as the image of the lost mother from back in time when the mother was lost, right? Mm-hmm. So there are these complicated questions of gender and the male gaze and sexuality, but Shakespeare seems to be at pains to reconstitute the nuclear family, or the mother, father, daughter triad at the end of each play. And it's interesting, Daniel, you mentioned the kind of Oedipal overtones of The Winter's Tale. You have a baby abandoned halfway across the world who's discovered by a shepherd with, like a magical box, just the same plot as Oedipus. And Pericles is also based on the story of Apollonius of Tyre. So it's Shakespeare kind of very consciously, in a kind of postmodern way, rewriting the classics in a way to bring them in line with Jacobean contemporary taste. He's taking out the kind of taboos of classical incest and replacing them with something more recognizable as complicated human relations, father-daughter relations, father-mother relations, husband-wife, right? These things that we can still relate to now, over 400 years later. But you chose a passage from when I believe Thaisa, the dead mother, is kind of brought back to life.
Yeah, and there's a little visual aid if we want to put up the picture that has a little bit of fire. There's nothing, it's just an exciting scene. You know, Thaisa has died in a storm at sea in childbirth, and the sailors think it's such bad luck to have a corpse on the boat that Pericles puts her in a trunk and casts her overboard. Well, lo and behold, of course, the trunk is washed up and she's not quite dead. And there's Zimmerman and a sort of magician. And the little text is, Zimmerman recognizes that perhaps there's a spell that can bring this unknown woman back to life. And then I just think that it's just some very pretty language. Zimmerman, when Thaisa starts to stir, she is alive. Behold her eyelids, cases to those heavenly jewels which Pericles hath lost, begin to part their fringes of bright gold. The diamonds of a most praised water doth appear to make the world twice rich. Live and make us weep to hear your fate, fair creature, rare as you seem to be. It's just, you know, so exciting. You know, it's the resurrection. We love the resurrection. You know, I think the curtain call of all shows is the resurrection. And that's why it's important to smile, to say we're here, we didn't die, we didn't leave. And we didn't subsume ourselves into our character. We are back, we're back, and we're all together again. That's why I hate a standoffish curtain call where the actors won't smile because the play was so serious, you know, and we're doing such a serious thing. No, we're at a symbol of the resurrection, in my opinion.
Beautiful.
I love that.
Yes, Myra, did you feel that? Did that chime for you?
What, the resurrection?
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I love that. Mm-hmm. Right. And there are some curtain calls where the whole company gets together and kind of does a dance.
Yeah.
Right. I love that. Yeah. You know, and even not Shakespeare, plug for Tina, what we do at the end with the singing, it's like a tonic. The whole audience is just, people are beyond happy. And if that isn't what we're here to do, I don't know what is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've also really connected, Daniel, with your illumination of the Mary, that was the Catholic relationship to Mary that was somehow being revisited through these plays. Because Catholicism was outlawed by this point, wasn't that right? That you couldn't, that just wasn't, you weren't allowed to do that. But maybe the theatre was a place where you could feel the euphoria and the spirituality, I suppose, which the church, even in the churches, you couldn't. If I got that right, Daniel?
Yeah, well, Black Friars, you know, used to be, of course, a monastery, just like you are in a church space now behind you that you're repurposing for theater, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet bird sang. There was always that kind of residue of the religious roots of theater that was displaced from, you know, religious communal guilds going from town to town doing Bible stories by this new urban London professional theater space. And, you know, some people even suggested like when Bottom turns into an ass, that might have been the donkey head from the manger scene that the mystery guilds used to put on. So that thrill, that I love that what Mary describes is that resurrection, she is alive. And in a way, that's why, right, tragedies would end with a jig that would be performed on stage that Bottom also makes fun of after he dies as Pyramus, and then pops up and says, do you want a Bergamask or a song? And it seems kind of tonally incongruous to us now, but who wouldn't want to be with Myra and Tina singing about the ability to overcome these obstacles that these plays set out?
Yeah, that's absolutely, and so fitting that we are speaking in these terms for our last episode, as we also look forward to the reopening of the theatres. Grace Ann, time is moving forwards. Is there anything you would like to share from our chat? And then I might hand over to our three guests for just a closing comment or two before we say goodbye. And Grace Ann.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to say that viewer Anne, and I'm sure many other viewers too, like us, just really loves the idea of a curtain call as a resurrection. I think for many people watching, that's a really beautiful new way to reframe that tradition that we've all grown accustomed to. And then I think just across the board, the whole evening, when we're speaking about, Mary, what you said about presence and what we've all spoken about, the importance of being together in a theater again, being in person, being in the space, sharing one moment. Everyone, couldn't even begin to count the names, the number of viewers who have shared our hope and desire for that. So I think we're all ready. We're all ready.
Well, I mean, if it be now, it is not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. I can't help thinking of the lines from Hamlet in that regard. But let me hand over to Myra for your kind of closing sentences, if I may, and then to Daniel, and then to Mary. Thank you, Myra.
Oh, well, thank you for letting me be here. This is Shakespeare. My mother had a teacher who used to say, let it become a part of your anatomy. I like that.
That's wonderful. Let it indeed become part of your anatomy, Myra. Thank you. Gorgeous. Daniel.
I was just thinking about the ending lines of The Winter's Tale, where Leontes invites everybody to go off stage and explain everything that happened in the show. Let each one demand an answer to his part performed in this wide gap of time since first we were dissevered. Hastily lead away. And I love the idea that so many of these plays end with, in essence, an invitation to an Act 6, where we're all going to leave the theater and talk about what happened. So I love getting to talk with you all here, and I hope that we can reconvene in another space and continue the conversation soon.
Wonderful, absolutely. The ending itself leading to a beginning. Mary.
I just want to say I was very struck by Myra's reiteration of the idea of the trustfulness of going to the theater. It's not only the trust that the audience gives us. I will sort of surrender myself. I'll sit in the dark. I'll face one direction and I won't talk. And I trust that you'll make that worth my while. You'll fill my consciousness with something worth it and beautiful and virtuosic and transporting, but also just the trust of like, gosh, we can all understand and feel the play, no matter like what else is going on in our lives or how divided we might be. You know, plays speak in a kind of metaphoric and symbolic language that draws on the archetypal and the unconscious. And it forms a kind of intimacy with strangers, because without being told what to feel, you know what things mean and you know how you're supposed to feel. And you know it's just a show, but in a very trusting, childlike way, you sort of just don't question it and sort of go along. And in return, hopefully you're transported somewhere and you are the richer for it. But it is a faithfulness. It's a great way to say it.
Dare I say, even when it goes well, a miracle. But before I hand over to Drew to do the signing off tonight, I'll just say a huge thank you to our audience, who have been an absolutely essential part of the spirit of inquiry and heartfelt, passionate curiosity, which have allowed us every week to create this hour of Shakespearean adventure. And so my gratitude to our fabulous guests, to Grace Ann, to Drew, to Gordon, our AV supervisor, and to everybody that's been with the show for so long. We're going to be taking a break. Do hang on, by the way, to hear about the season announcement. And I can't wait to see you in one form or another very soon. Drew.
Thank you, Simon. And what I take away from this is that we're ready for a Pericles revival. Bring on Gower in 2023. And good night, everyone. Thank you for being such wonderful, faithful companions. Thank you to all of our wonderful, brilliant panelists.